We are now transitioning from that intensive working discussion, which I saw you all participating in vigorously, to the launching part of the program. We don't call it a conclusion because all we're ever doing is picking up more work, it seems. But we have some closing parts of the program, this panel and another panel and some important speeches. And this panel, the panelists weren't listed because we really were waiting to see how things would develop in the panel, in the breakthrough groups, and identify people who, from those breakthrough groups that we felt we needed to highlight based on what was said and what wasn't said so far. So I'd like to introduce the panelists here. On my far left is Angela McKay. She's a senior principal security strategist with Microsoft, and she also has a number of industry leadership positions, including the vice chair of the IT Sector Coordinating Council, an interface between the government and the industry in the United States. And immediately on my left is Stu Goldman. He's a longtime colleague from Bell Labs, a Bell Labs fellow, and he also does a number of consulting work for a number of government and non-government entities in the area of a lot of advanced technology issues dealing with payload. On my immediate right is Michael O'Riordan. Michael is a chairman of the MAWG, Message Anti-Abuse Working Group, an international group that fights spam and botnets. And he's also a Comcast fellow. And Comcast is the largest ISP in the United States. And on my far right is Dean Viverka. Dean is the chair of the International Cable Protection Committee, the ICPC, and he's also a vice president of operations of Southern Cross, a undersea cable consortium. Yeah. Okay. First question, I'd like to turn to Angela. Angela's been with us from the beginning, back to Dallas at our first summit, and just ask Angela for her perspective on what she's observed over these 3 summits. Angela?
Thanks, Carl. Ooh, that's loud. So it's been a pleasure to participate in the last 3 years of conferences, and there are certainly things that have changed over time and other things that have stayed the same. So maybe I'll highlight first what has stayed the same and then move on to some of the things that have changed. First, I think what's really important is that this has always been a very active and engaging dialogue. So for anyone who's been in one of these breakthrough groups, I don't think anyone would characterize them generally as quiet. They've been very vigorous, very engaged, and that's really a credit to the folks that are here in the audience, because that's the commitment you need to bring to the table to put your ideas out and discuss them with your other colleagues. I also think that one of the things that has remained the same is generally the sense of commitment that I feel when I am engaging in these conversations. You have a lot of people who are very passionate and committed to improving cybersecurity, and that's really encouraging. And maybe a little bit on the differences. So a couple of differences. There's been a change a little bit in who is participating in the room. So this has always been a very internationally focused conference. But I do think as we've moved from Dallas to London, here to Delhi, that we've seen an even greater participation and diversity of the international participants along the way. Also, on the industry side, so there's been greater diversity on the government side and greater diversity on the industry side from a geographical perspective, but also from a makeup of the industries that are represented. I noticed in Dallas you definitely had more of an IT and ISP focus, and you still see a lot of that here. But now I'm seeing more folks from civil society and from organizations that are focused on workforce development. And I think those are really encouraging changes in the overall makeup of the participants in the group. I also noticed that the conversations are becoming more evolved and more nuanced. So I think that's a commentary that the awareness of cybersecurity issues and about possible mitigations is going up. And I think that's really encouraging. We heard that last night, that in order for us to begin to move forward on this, you first have a level of awareness. And I think that's a really important conversation that's been going on. And then finally, and I think, Carl, you'll be encouraged to hear this, there are actual outcomes that have been driven through this process. So seeing in the first year, it was the first year, there were no definitive outcomes. But now we've seen considerable work being moved forward in botnet mitigation and in helping to understand the issues involved in undersea cables. Yet we still have a lot more to do. And so the other outcome that I want to highlight that goes back to similarities is in this conversation, the commitment to coming to the table, the commitment to having these vigorous conversations helps to drive the awareness and really will move forward the ball. And I think these are all very encouraging changes over time, and I look forward to participating in next year in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Angela. Stu, you said you'd like to make some comments about the survey statistics that we shared this morning. What is it that you want to tell us about?
Okay, I think I surprised Carl when he asked me what I wanted to talk about, and I think he was thinking I was going to pick something, I don't know, like priority international communication. And I really surprised him when I said, I'd really like to talk about the survey results, and he's letting me do that, so thank you, Carl. As you know, when we started, we were asked 7 questions in the participant opening survey, and then the results of that were shared with us this morning. And 6 of the questions, the results were very predictable. We're trending in a certain way, and we're becoming more aware of the problems, and our country may be able to better defend itself and so on. And 1 question stood out from all the others, Carl, and you even showed the results up on the wall. And that was question 2, which is, cyberspace is a truly new society that deserves its own new rules, a partly new society that deserves some of its own new rules, an extension of the real world, and most of its rules should apply, a complete extension of the real world, and all of its rules should apply, or I don't know. Okay? And the results that you shared with us were really that 27% of the group thought it's all new, brand new territory, virgin area, and all new rules should apply. 37% of the group said some of the rules should apply. And 34% said, all of the old rules should apply. And you also commented that this was very divided because, it's roughly equal parts for each, and that you had gotten the same result in the previous surveys. So I'm surprised that we haven't looked at that and said, why are we so divided? Why do we have a non-converging view? Why are things in different pockets and different people are thinking very different things? And I'm wondering, and I think I have an answer, okay, which is always good. As an engineer, you go back to the root. And I think the answer is, we think these things about cyberspace because I'm not sure we have a common definition of what cyberspace is. So in your mind, cyberspace is this, and yes, it's brand new. You get sucked into the matrix. You put the virtual reality hat in, and if something bad happens to you while you're in the virtual reality, you die. All of the things that you see from the movies. Okay. Other people see it as an extension of the current world, just going in farther. And some people say it's really the same humans that are doing it. It's not a new dimension. It's not a new space like land, sea, air, outer space, and then cyberspace. But it is really still physical. It's electrons, it's wires, it's computers, okay? And it's the same thing. It's just the technology is maybe faster than we're used to. It's computer-based. Okay, so you send email, okay, which is a packet inside an envelope, okay? Or you used to send regular mail, which is a packet inside an envelope, okay? You dropped it into the mailbox, which could be your computer, or it could be the mailbox in the corner, and somehow it got mixed in with all the other packets and envelopes and got delivered to the other end and sorted out. So is there a huge difference? It's kind of the way you look at it. And other people will look at it and say, this is completely new. It's a high definition. It's a high transmission rate. Everything is instantaneous. We're all interconnected. There are no boundaries. So what I'm suggesting from this long dialogue here is perhaps one of the things we could think about doing for the cybersecurity version 4 meeting is have a panel session on what is cyberspace. If we knew better what it was and we had a better handle on it, I think we might see that our understandings of it would converge.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks, Stu. Yeah. Maybe I'll just share one. I don't know what you're going to say. I'll share one observation is that it seems to me that those that emphasize that cyberspace is not something that new and that the existing rules should apply tends to be those who have a lot of power and position and maybe see it as competing. That seems to be, from an interest perspective, an observation. But yeah, I think more discussion and dialogue on that would be very helpful, and some more clarity. Because obviously if people see things fundamentally different, that's going to influence a lot the kind of policies they think are appropriate. So thanks for Stu. Let's see, Dean, I'll actually go to you next here on, can you tell us a little bit about the ICPC, the International Cable Protection Committee, what its mission is and who makes it up and what it's doing?
Okay. And link that into cybersecurity, I guess.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
The ICPC was formed in 1958 and we currently have 130 members from 60 countries. And all of our members either own or operate the submarine cable, or 98% of submarine cables, international submarine cables around the world. So probably it is the voice of the industry in terms of that infrastructure. Typically, and originally we looked at physical protection as our main role. Lately we've been working on the legislative protection and other protection means. So we work strongly with governments and we work with other UN bodies. So we've published literature with UNEP. We have an MOU with the ISA and they're looking into these new marine mining leases in the deep ocean, and so there's encroachment on existing submarine cables. We also work with WMO, and of recent we've been working with the ITU on green initiatives. So can the submarine cable infrastructure be used to monitor things like tsunami warning and climate change? So it's quite a big remit in terms of what we're working on. The last couple of years, certainly the last 3 years, we've been happy and proud to work with East-West Institute and have attended each of the summits, and we're at the initial Raguchi workshop in Dubai. And from that, there have been several recommendations which ICPC has taken up. One of those was to increase, I guess, the international governance. And as a result of that, we opened up our membership to governments, and we have several governments that now belong directly to the ICPC. And this has created a forum where the public-private discussions can start taking place, and it really is a two-way educational process for both of us. I think if I reflect back to what Minister Sybil said on the opening keynote, he made some very key observations, and one of those was that submarine cables are often overlooked, but they are very critical and form part of the critical infrastructure. He pointed out that they carry $10 trillion a day in financial transactions, and that doesn't include the internet and the social media that's carried on them. And therefore they need to be protected. So we're very encouraged to hear those comments, and it shows that the governments need to be educated, the policymakers need to understand the critical nature of submarine cables. I think if you look at cybersecurity, if that's a virtual gatekeeper of cyberspace, then submarine cable network is the physical media that connects all that. And certainly without the submarine cable network, you don't have the internet and you don't have cyberspace.
Absolutely, yeah. And Dina, you mentioned that one of the things that the ICPC has done since the Raguchi Summit is to open its membership up, and I heard you, extend an invitation to the Indian government while you're here this week to become a member, just like other governments around the world have now become part of the ICPC.
Yeah, it's very encouraging to hear from the Deputy General Director of Department of Telecommunications, who agreed that one of our aims is to try and get a single point of contact within governments, because governments are huge machines. There's several departments typically that have their hands within telecommunications and other spaces. So our aim is to try and find a lead agency that the industry can communicate with, and let that lead agency disseminate information and provide the feedback.
What are just a few examples of other governments that are members now of ICPC?
Probably our strongest representation is from Australia, so I'm glad that as an Australian I can say that. They're at the moment probably the world leader in terms of legislation. They've enacted all of their obligations under UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention of Law of the Sea, and sadly only a handful of governments have done that. But they're a leader in best-in-class practices at the moment, and they're very proud of sending that message out. So they've put themselves out there to be that best-in-class leader.
And some other governments besides Australia that have become members of the...
We have Singapore, we have Malta. Uruguay has just enacted some new legislation based on the Australian experience. So these governments are starting to work together to form some common goals and practices and legislation in terms of protecting the critical infrastructure.
Very good, thank you. Okay, let's turn to Michael. Michael, as I mentioned, is one of the leaders of the MOG, and he brought a very serious group with him. He just didn't come out by himself, but he came along with several colleagues. Feel free to mention them, Michael, that they came out here to work with experts from India on fighting spam and botnets. You saw some statistics about the progress we're making with breakthrough group recommendations. We come up with an innovative idea, then it gets implemented. The ultimate stage is for it to become institutionalized for long-term sustainability. So the MOG is an example of a group like the ICPC that's taken recommendations and implemented them and make sure they can move forward. So, Michael, you had a major pre-summit event that's hosted by FICI. I call it a mini MOG, I guess. And tell us what the good things that happened that you saw there in terms of progress that you were able to make this week.
Yeah, just before I do that, perhaps just a couple of words about MORG. I mean, we've been around since 2004. We're an industry-funded, active group, and we've been fighting spam since 2004. Around about 2008, we decided that we really needed to pay some attention to the bot and malware problem. And just last year, we renamed ourselves the Messaging, Malware, and Mobile Anti-Abuse Working Group, or as one of our rather smarter members called it, M³A²WG. Our charter really is to deal with overall abuse on the internet, and the sort of membership that we have ranges from Google to Microsoft, Facebook, Comcast, France Telecom, a whole variety of international ISPs, a lot of vendors such as Symantec, and a lot of the reputable senders, the people that send you the email that you actually want to receive on a commercial basis. So they send on behalf of a lot of major corporations all over the globe. So what was our aim in coming out to run initially the mini MORG, as Carl refers to it? Our aim was to actually instigate a MORG in India, to actually get a group of people, and I have to reflect on it, to be championed it from the bottom up. This is something that you can't do cybersecurity without trust. I mean, I think that's absolutely fundamental to the entire process. So you need to get together a group of folks that will trust each other, that will be prepared to work actively on behalf of the enterprises or the government or whatever section of society that they represent, to actually deal with the problems, because there are some significant problems all over the globe when it comes to spam, when it comes to malware, and India has its share just as every other country does, and unfortunately at times India has more than really I would call its fair share. So we spent the day going through what MORG does, seeing how it could be tailored to a particular Indian environment, looking for champions, looking to see who would be prepared to work with us. And the outcome, I believe, was that we left the room with a bunch of people, some of whom are incented to do this. We believe that there is a good chance, but it is going to require a great deal of active local effort. The kind of support that the sort of overall MORG body is prepared to do is we're prepared to share all our best practices, all our documentation, all our process to facilitate it so that this group can get off the ground and become a viable group in its own right, dealing with things that really impact, and I don't hear so much of it here, but actually impact the consumer, the millions and millions of people who are relying on the internet to conduct the everyday business of getting access to the bank, checking on their prescriptions being delivered, getting email from their loved ones. And this is what malware and spam impact. I mean, the critical thing we do have to bear in mind is if you've got malware on your machine, even if you can't really fix it, what you can do is you can change your mind about banking online for a few days until you do get it sorted out. And so we need to actually get people active in these areas and to get the ISPs to care about it. I mean, I think one of the challenges is as an industry develops, they tend to concentrate on things like growth. And one of the important things is going to be when you look at the ISPs, they don't have to just have growth, they have to have security as well, because their customers are seen as targets, they're seen as ripe for the plucking. And there's a bunch of really clever criminal enterprises out there that are out there purely because they can steal the credentials, the information, and ultimately the money of of people who are on the internet.
Yeah, well, thanks, Mike. In addition to the discussions you've been able to have to increase the collaboration with India between the MOG members, is there anything that was, still needs improvement from, I know this is a huge task you're taking on, it's a huge country here and stuff, and in terms of expectations for what you try to accomplish here, are there some things that that are still left that need more attention yet?
Yeah, it was interesting to hear Angela refer to the Dallas Summit as one where there were a lot of ISPs. I would really like that model to have been here. We need more ISPs to be involved. And I think that's the thing, that if the Morg India thing is to succeed, and if the bot and malware initiative that's been launched by this group by East West Institute is to be taken up, we do need to get more ISPs involved, and we need the commitment of the senior people in the ISPs who will go and tell. And because we're looking for a sort of broad church of people to come and actually be involved at Morg. We're looking for policy folks. We're looking for engineers. We're looking for people who deal with abuse on a day-to-day basis. So you're looking for a wide range of people, all of whom can input into the kind of things that we do at Morg. I mean, and I think one of the important things is to bear in mind, that we would seek to sort of mold Morg India in the same way as we conduct our own, the greater sort of global Morg, is that we're not a lobbying organisation. I mean, what we do is we come up and we talk, when we do talk to regulators, we talk to government, we say, you can make any decision you like, be it left or right, we don't really mind, but, depending on what decision you make, these are going to be the technical consequences. And the one that I generally highlight was when there was the great net neutrality debate in the United States. One of the sort of bits of advice that we transmitted is, if you so interfere with net neutrality that spammers can construe any interference with sending email, which is effectively what anti-spam technologies are, as a breach of net neutrality, what you're going to get is you're going to get 19 emails you don't want for every one you do want, because there's about 95% spam on the internet. So we just said, do you want 19 bad emails and one good one, or do you want to listen to some advice? And I think that's one of the things that we'd also try and inculcate in the local Morg.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mike. Hey, Dean, just going back to you, I know there's one particular area that the ICPC is really trying to work with India here, and you co-led a meeting with a government representative, and could you share with the audience how that went from your perspective?
Yes,
and maybe explain the problem a little bit too. Yeah.
Okay. So we had a specific recommendation that we've been working on for a while, and that recommendation was to prioritise and minimise the time it takes to repair a submarine cable break. And if you have a submarine cable break, it takes about 14 days to repair, from ship sailing to getting on site and repairing that. During that time, some of that traffic may have been rerouted onto other cables, but it puts those other cables in a hazardous condition so that if they broke, the problem is compounded. So most of the countries have become aware of that and try and streamline the permitting process, especially if the cable break is within the territorial seas or exclusive economic zone of a nation. Unfortunately, India is well beyond the average. So it's very encouraging, and they should be applauded on their efforts, because they've taken that on board. They've worked and consulted with the local carriers here in India, consulted with industry, have now accepted and recognised the issue, and have made a commitment to try and fix that. And in typical Indian style, they want to go beyond that. So they've also committed to not only fixing the problems, but they want to be the best-in-class leader in this. And I think that's important for countries because, again, as Minister Siebel had alluded to yesterday, India is and will be a cyberspace superpower. In order to do that, you need to have the infrastructure investment, and submarine cables are very expensive. So to attract businesses to do that, they need to have certainty and incentive to go into a country, to build networks in there. They need to have certainty of process and understand the processes so that they can factor those things in. So I think it's very important from an advertising point of view, if you like, for India to attract a whole raft of cyber business, that the infrastructure needs to be there, and you need to do that by fixing up those processes. In this case, recommendation number 2, to improve the timely repair of submarine brakes.
And what did you think of your government counterparts' update on their work in this area? How did you feel about that?
Again, I guess the initial reaction is that we need to applaud their commitment to this. So, as I mentioned...
And there was actually applause in that room, wasn't there?
There was applause. So
you actually applauded, yeah.
led by the Indian carriers. So I think, as we've mentioned, all governments are very big machines. They have several departments. Department of Telecommunications have taken it upon themselves to lead that reform and change in this particular area.
Good. Okay, thanks, Dean. Let me turn back over to this side here. Angela, you were very much involved, along with your team from Microsoft, in discussions on Monday, the pre-meeting events, and also the breakthrough groups yesterday and today. I wonder if you give maybe your perspective on the 3 breakthrough groups that were initiated from the India interests here, one on supply chain integrity, the one on payload security, and one on international policies for the cloud. Can you share some insights on how you thought those went and anything worth noting?
Certainly, and I was very grateful to be able to participate in those particular sessions. Those are of common interest not only to the Indian nationals here, but also to governments around the world and to Microsoft. A couple of things about those sessions. Those were relatively new topic areas. Supply chain security was included in the London conference. But a couple of things that I heard as key themes coming out that I think are worthy of sharing here. I heard a lot more about risk management in each one of these sessions, thinking about the complexity of the changing threats and dealing with those over time, a recognition that security is, if you will, not a destination, but rather a journey along the way, and also a great deal more about how to have industry and government work together in a more collaborative way. I do think that there's always been an intent in these areas to have industry and government work together, but there is more on transparency and how do we start to understand each other's perspectives, and that while we may have the same overarching goals, that our ideas on how to reach those goals sometimes differ. And it was done in a very convivial way, so people were getting along and saying, yes, I feel that I could sit down with someone who maybe I haven't sat down with before, and we could start to roll up our sleeves, if you will, and work on the problems together. One other thing that I thought was really interesting, in particular in cloud and supply chain security, is when I've talked with different governments and different industries around the world on these topics previously, I heard a lot more about national approaches, that we need to figure this out here, and we must have absolutes, and you can have risk aversion. And what I was hearing in these conversations that I thought was really interesting is a clear recognition of the global nature of cyberspace and the importance of more international approaches to solving some of these problems. I thought that was a really interesting change and very consistent with, I think, the dialogue that EWI is intending to drive. And maybe the last thing was, both in supply chain security and in the cloud session and in payload security, there was a great deal of stimulating conversation, and I think new ideas that I hadn't heard in other places before. And that's really exciting. I think that really gets back to some of what I talked about earlier, where you have a more diverse group with different interests, and they can start to bounce ideas off of each other. You can actually come up with something new and innovative, and you can start to connect people, and I think hopefully really drive progress. And maybe the last thing is a comment on progress. In both of these areas, I think there was a clear recognition that these are not easy problems, and that they're not going to be solved in the near term, and again, that's going to be more of a journey. But I do think there was a clear recognition of that there can be incremental steps made to mitigate some of these risks, and in those incremental steps, there can be things done by vendors, things done by government, things that we can work on together, and then start to cross, as I said, national boundaries and start to do bilateral and multilateral approaches to these problems. And considering the international nature of cyberspace, that's going to be necessary to drive progress.
All right, thanks, Angela. Before I ask the next question to Stu, I just wanted to point out to the audience that we have enough time to entertain some questions from you. So if you want to prepare and think about what you might want to ask this panel, please go ahead and get ready to do that, and I'll ask a question to Stu, and then we'll transition into that. So Stu, the East West Institute came out with the Priority International Communications, or the PIC report, just recently, and you were a primary driver in this field for many years. The report's gone out. You've done some sessions here. What would you like to tell the audience here about this capability that maybe you felt hasn't gotten out yet, or just we should take the time to do? So.
Okay, that's a hard question, but let me preface that by saying that I've been doing priority communications since 1988, so it's really near and dear in my heart. Okay, and I was delighted in Dallas when East West Institute saw that this was an area where they could participate and make a difference. The situation as it stood was that the technology for how to do international priority communications is well documented, it well exists, the standards are done, but it's not happening. Why isn't it happening? So we took that on as a challenge in Dallas, as you know. It did fit within the EWI structure very well and could benefit from this. And we came up with some recommendations, some next steps, and we fleshed out the problem. And then we moved on to London, and we refined the recommendations, we added some more next steps, and then, as you said, we produced a comprehensive report on what priority international communication is and what it is not, and the technology behind it, and the value that it would offer, and actionable recommendations, or 4 actionable recommendations that say these are the things that we need to do in order to build an awareness of this, to have the stakeholders come and say, yes, I have a need for this, to have the vendor community and the governments come together and the network carriers come together and say, yes, we can build something like this, to come together and to talk about, yes, this needs to be funded, yes, we can do that, and then to have agreements for it to roll out. And it can roll out on an individual basis. You can start by having an arrangement between 2 countries. You can add a 3rd country. You can add a 4th country. And we're very fortunate in that the technology is not an all-or-none technology. You don't have to not have it or to have it everywhere. You can start by having little clusters of it, and as you add nodes that have the capability, then the capability just grows and grows. So it's not binary.
Stu, in the simplest terms, for someone here who hasn't even picked up the report at all and this is the first time they're hearing about it, what is priority international communications?
Okay, well, surely there's no one here who hasn't read the report from cover to cover, but just in that case that someone has walked in, and I don't mean to be facetious, but as you know, all communication's equal, but some are more equal than others. When you have an emergency like a hurricane in the East Coast, an earthquake, a tsunami, all sorts of crises that happen, there are people who are involved that really need to communicate when there's a jamming of the networks because there are too many people trying to talk. And this priority communication gives a preference to those people who are trying to restore the situation, to the political authorities who are trying to maintain law and order, to the people who are trying to repair the electricity, the water, get fuel going. So there are a number of people that are involved in restoration. If this makes sense on a national basis, gee, wouldn't it also make sense on an international basis? To pick an example that we talked about earlier today, you had the 9/11 event in New York City, which is in the United States. Very, very close to New York City is another country called Canada. And they were trying to communicate with the United States saying, do you need blood? Do you need ambulances? The U.S. couldn't reach out to Canada, and the Canadians couldn't come in to the U.S. to talk about coordination of facilities because we didn't have an international arrangement. I am very pleased to inform you that there was already a situation of PIC in existence. We have worked out the details. And again, these are not technical details, these are the political details, so that there is now priority international communications between entities in Canada and those in the US.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the one example in the world. I think it was done for one of the Olympic Games. There was some preparation done, yeah. Okay, well, thanks, Stu. Well, let me see if there's any questions out there in the audience. I see somebody, they're walking up the aisle. Okay, I see some hands. Could you approach the microphone, please? Yep.
Okay. Thanks, Carl. So just a quick one, actually. I'm a first-time attendee to this conference here, and I think we've heard some really, really interesting debates and discourses emerging from, the conversations we've had over the last 2 days. But just a quick one, Carl. So for someone like me who's come here, contributed, and as a first-time participant, can you walk us through what happens, just sort of the main themes that have emerged from these conversations, and can you tell us what are sort of the next steps on the ideas and the discussions that have come out, the recommendations, and those sort of things? How is that incorporated into sort of actual papers, or where does all of this thought go?
Yeah, sure. Very, very good question. So we in every breakthrough group, we've passed around a sheet of paper asking for your name, affiliation, and contact information, so we know which breakthrough groups individuals were interested in, so we don't send out mass emails on every topic to everyone. So, and if that's not the case, if you didn't identify yourself in one of those breakthrough groups, please send a message back to someone on the staff and indicate what areas you're interested in. So different breakthrough groups are at different stages. Some are still at the exploration of what the problem is, and that's not a bad thing. Spending half your time understanding the problem well is very important. In fact, we had an American president, Abraham Lincoln, who said something like, the number of hours changes. If I had 8 hours to chop down a tree, I'd spend 6 sharpening my axe. So really getting prepared well to take on the challenge is very important. But we then move on to articulating recommendations and understanding what the alternatives are and consequences, and clarifying the benefits. And we try to have a lot of rigor in that discussion, make sure we have international representation, make sure we have the stakeholders engaged. People are actually going to have to implement this stuff, so we really are accurately reflecting their interests. And then we'll produce a report. So we invite people to participate in those processes based on the interest. So for example, the measuring the cybersecurity problem is one that is very near getting ready to be published. That report will probably be published by the end of the year. So we will, now that we've got additional people showing up participating in that, we will send out the draft in its current state, which has a lot of consensus support already, to get the additional people who were engaged to get their feedback on the language in that report. For those that are very early stages, there's a lot more opportunities. And if you look at the Priority National Communications Report and you see the contributors, you'll see many of those contributors that came on board because they were involved in the London Summit, for example. So not everybody decides to stay involved, and that's fine, but we go ahead and we engage those who've identified themselves. So we look very much, these things are the result of your work, so we very much need to keep you engaged in that. So thank you for the question.
Hello.
Sorry, go ahead. Okay, how about if we take on this side and then we'll go over here? Go ahead, Greg.
Yes, quick question, well, not a quick question. In a group like this, there are many challenges bringing people to the table, and one of the questions is that you have in the survey is this are we all in this together or not? And I think most people in this room would agree that we are in this together. And the question is, what have you found most effective to bring people who don't initially share that view to the table, to convince them to become involved in the various breakout groups and the efforts that you've had underway with now that you've had the third council, the third summit? Can you give any examples of what brought someone to the table to help them to become more involved than they were initially?
Yeah. Okay. That is a very important question, because often when we do something, I try to build the best possible teams we can. So for example, I'm sure young Lynn is probably here somewhere, my co-author with the China-U.S. bilateral work on fighting spam to build trust. When we began that initiative, what I did was I got out a sheet of paper and wrote down the dream team, like who would be the best possible team. in the United States. And in Young Lin, his team actually had some ideas, from a Chinese view. And it's interesting, they knew American companies a lot better than the Americans knew the Chinese companies. But they said, you need to have Google on there, you need to have AT&T, you need to have Comcast, and they knew these players. And we went out and we sought these people. And the people I reached out to, when you explain what you're trying to do, you get passionate people. If you get the best person in a company, like Comcast, who's fighting spam and botnets, these are people who are passionate about this, and they want to do everything they can to do this better. So often, if you explain what you're trying to do, and it's a legitimate, really good mission, people are attracted to that. And often the best people are attracted to that. We had the best people, Monica Chu, the person in charge of security for Gmail, and just go down the list. We had a world-class team on this. There are some times when an organization is identified and someone, you can't seem to recruit somebody because these people are also very busy. And so then you go to your second stage of trying to point out that, hey, look, everybody else is involved, and you feel you're going to miss out if you don't get this opportunity, and that could work. But ultimately, we're a philanthropic organization. We depend on volunteers, and I tell John Rose and our team at the Institute and the board of directors, the biggest contribution we have, and it's not on the balance sheets, but it's volunteer experts. It's millions of dollars if you quantify it of in-kind contributions of expertise, and it's given willingly, not only because people want to solve technical problems, but as John Rose taught me from the first conversations I've had him about this institute, that you don't get real hard problems solved like this, whether it's the institute working in the regional security or trying to address terrorism or Cold War type tensions, unless you have people with heart. And as you probably could tell from the breakthrough groups, you could tell from the people up here, there's people who are very passionate about doing things just beyond it's their job. It's the right thing to do. I mean, people in this industry realize that there's a lot of people they're never going to meet who are dependent upon these communications being up. And there's a sense in this industry that we need to do things like that. There's a painting that U.S. West used to hold up as its image. It's, I think, in 1888. It's a picture of this telephone wire repairman out in a blizzard, walking between posts. And it's just a sense of, we have to keep this stuff up. We have to keep it working and such. And so, hopefully that answers your question, and maybe a little bit more telling you about the appreciation, hopefully a sense of appreciation I have for all of you who are participating in this. I think I have a question over here. I see 2 minutes, so maybe.
Yes, Carl, just to complement your thought, I represent Huawei Technology, and we have been actively participating in this conference for the last 2 days. My background is in security. I am a PhD graduate from IIT Bombay, and I have been working security for 18 years. And Huawei has been actively participating in this conference. So just to add this thought, how actually we are participating there. My question is to Michael, that for this MOG India chapter group, we are very much interested, and what is your thought process, and what do you think you will bring into the table so that we'll participate and make it, rather from India side, we want to participate this. And the second point is we want to also participate in the metrics of finding the security of services, because initially it was thought security is an intangible thing. You cannot measure it. Now you can find out security you can measure by means of metrics as you measure in the quality of service. So my question is, Michael, how actually we can cooperate each other?
So I understand you're saying how can you get involved and how you can work. I mean, this is a group that's going to require champions. The way to do this is to become one of the activists, one of the leaders. Stand up and say, I want to propose that there's a meeting on the 25th of so-and-so in this room, and I know 5 or 6 people who are interested, and you can reach out to, we've got a bloke working with us from Chennai, Suresh Ramasubramanian. Reach out to him and say, we need you there. And it really is, this is an activist organization. To do what you've got to do, it's got to start from the bottom up, and that's the only way it's going to work. This is the way we put Morg together. 10, 15 people got in a room in Boston in 2004 and went, this spam problem is something awful. We've got to do something about it. And we've gone from there to a sort of internationally recognized organization that is taken seriously both academically, by government, and by industry, and by vendors, very, very seriously by vendors, actually contributing massively towards the suppression of problems which confront users on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think we're out of time. If you please join me in thanking the panelists. I appreciate that. Thanks you guys. Okay, thanks.